Hello everybody, it is Friday, June the 23rd, and today I'm doing another astrology video, and the topic is going to be about Mercury square to Neptune. But before I get into that, I will just also mention that there's another aspect that's been perfecting around the same time. Actually, I just checked, and on June the 25th, Mercury square Neptune will perfect, as well as Mars square Uranus, both perfecting on the same day, both active at the same time, and both contributing to the overall climate, astrological climate right now. And they're related in the sense that Uranus is in Taurus and Neptune is in Pisces, and there's a rough sextile between Uranus and Neptune. So Uranus and Neptune are actually seeing each other, making some kind of connection, although it's really the squares that are the most dramatic right now. The square between Mars in Leo and Uranus in Taurus, and the square between Mercury in Gemini and Neptune in Pisces. But Mars in Taurus cannot see Neptune, or cannot see the Pisces planets. And I was just thought I'd mention that at the beginning anyways, going into this, because there have been a number of dramatic news stories. I made my last video on June the 19th, and since that time there have been a number of viral media stories in the news. And in my last video, I did mention at around the time of my last video on June the 19th that the Sun was at the late degrees of Gemini in this square to Neptune. So there was a Sun square Neptune aspect strongly in effect during the last video that I made. And I even kind of, while I was making that video, even though it was about the sextile between Saturn in Pisces and Jupiter in Taurus, there was the dynamic. I talked about Lord of the Rings a lot. You know, I think that in some way, if you're doing archetypal, imaginal stuff, there's something about the fantasy, imagination element to Neptune that will work its way in regardless. But I think there's something about, I felt like this sort of like, there's the idea of the images and the metaphors that we use for reality and the actual reality itself, and I felt like I was kind of like getting swept up in like talking about wizards and magic and stuff like this, right? And I think that's something that could be very strong when either Neptune squaring the Sun, or now we have a continuation of this with Mercury falling behind, going through the square to Neptune. And anyway, so I was just mentioning that last time I made the video that the aspect with the Sun was already there, and now over the next few days the aspect with Mercury is going to kick into effect. And one of the things that I noticed was in the news there were certain stories, let's say, of killer whale attacks, and as well as this dramatic thing about a submarine getting lost that was visiting the wreckage of the Titanic. Right? And one of the things about this that I have to say, first of all, is that in Rick Tarnas's Cosmos and Psyche, if you look up the chapter where he talks about Uranus and Neptune conjunct, he talks about the age of the internet. In the 90s, we had a lot of people born during the early to mid-90s were born under a Uranus-Neptune conjunction in Capricorn. And Rick Tarnas attributes this to the rise of the information age, the digital age, and that Uranus usually takes the association of being about technological advancements, breakthroughs with new technology. But Neptune, when combined with Uranus, has something to do with, in this, whatever Rick Tarnas was saying, has to do with the kind of the collective psyche, the collective imagination, and the ability to connect with others socially, I guess you would say, and the kind of shared like people often talk about the internet as if it's a kind of like an unconscious area, like where people go there to dream. Like we're all dreaming online, and then we have to get off the internet and do our day life. But it's a place. There's something about the internet which is essentially imaginal. Whether that means you're playing a video game, whether that means you're using technology, like to make multimedia artwork, whether you're using AI art, whether you're making an Avatar movie. This is all, it's kind of using both the Uranus and the Neptune, and then the Neptune's like the imaginal fantasy element, and also there's this sort of collective thing. I think people kind of say that the outer planets, because they have such slow orbits compared to the inner planets, right? Like the ones that are closest to the sun are generally judged to be more personal, and the outer planets are all kind of considered to be more transpersonal. But there's something about Neptune, specifically, the way that people in non-duality talk about just another drop in the ocean, right? There's something about Neptune which stands for this sort of like the masses, the ocean, the collective unconsciousness, the dream is all very Neptune. And which is interesting to me is that when there's a risk of getting, as I would say, swept up into the collective waves, right? As if it's you're like a surfer who gets swept up into the massive rolling waves or whatever. And the way that trending social media works is that the way that it works is that if you like a post on Facebook or something like this that's about one of these trending news stories, or react to it, then you're letting the algorithm know that you find this interesting, and that the algorithm will then show you more posts about the same story. And then what tends to happen is that people realize that the more they talk about these trending things, the more they get given priority in the algorithm, given priority in the news feed. And one of the things that I noticed about this was that, okay, you got to consider at least, I'll give, in this particular transit, Mercury is a writer, Mercury is a communicator, Mercury is a messenger, right? And at least in Gemini, Mercury has dignity, so that with Mercury is getting, Neptune's in a superior position to Mercury, and it's in a square, which is kind of difficult, but Mercury's protected because Mercury is in its natural Gemini habitat. Gemini likes to talk about things, Gemini likes to communicate, and, a little imagination, why not? Mercury can play with that, right? But there's something about that first of all, just like the occurrence of these different things that had to do with the ocean, right? And the depths. The submarine had to do with the depths. The Orca attacks have been maybe more on the surface of the ocean, right? But there's this thing about it where, I'll just give you an example, right? There's on social media, I have to admit that I don't use Twitter, and I'm on Facebook, and Facebook's just kind of taken over by boomers anyways. But there are some, so I go on social media and I hold my tongue and I don't criticize and I just kind of take it all in. But I have to admit that some of my friends were sharing they were really boomer takes or whatever, or bad. There's certain things where I don't necessarily disagree with the politics. There's one post that I saw, anyways, where I will just kind of paraphrase anyways, but the person was trying to talk about there's a kind of an ego thing, right? That we are us Westerners are so possessed by our egos that we think that we have control over the seas and the domains of the ocean, and that that anybody with the money can go. It's a kind of a hubris, right? I've seen this sentiment actually argued a lot, right, or brought up, and I think this is very indicative of the square to Neptune, because Neptune indicates something of the kind of the numinous, maybe even the transpersonal, and there's the human being in respect to this great mystery of life. So in some way I actually agree with the sentiment. It's not that I disagree, right? But there's something about it where this one person was using, you can use the circumstances of this trending news story to spark the imagination and do some writing, which is all Mercury square Neptune. And so far, so good, actually. I kind of agree with the sentiment. But then the guy was just kind of spinning it in this direction where it's And it's our, you know, you can kind of see how this goes, where we are Westerners caught in our ego, disconnected from numinous, disconnected from spirit, and as such, we are entrenched in capitalism, and we are our whole society is at the whim and mercy of corporations, right? And that the whole thing is until, and this guy's like making this. He starts out talking about like having respect for the numinous and the and this kind of and man's place in the universe, and then by the end of it, it's like he's like, until we hold the corporations in check, it's us in that submarine. We're all in the bottom of the submarine about to get crushed by the ocean because we're too caught up in our ego. And it's kind of like, you know, there's just something about it where it's just like, I know some people like, I don't know. To me, I just thought it was kind of cheesy, even though I kind of agree with the sentiment. It's kind of like this sort of like, this whole thing about getting swept up into the wave of the collective, and to be like, being kind of addicted to the process of media consumption, of being, and kind of like, it's all about how to, and trying to like garner more attention. But like, I'm using this now, I'm talking about these current events, so maybe I'm just as bad as this guy was, right? But at least I can talk about it in terms of getting seized by the archetypes or whatever, and what kind of influences to expect when Mercury is squaring Neptune, right? Is that like trying to, these big collective things happening, but being like, okay, how do I cleverly, you know, tie this into getting my point across, which may not really, it ends up being a bit of a stretch whether this is actually about the submarine, you're making some sort of grandiose ideological political statement or something. I thought it was kind of funny anyways. There's another one though around the same theme that I was talking to. My mom was telling me about this. My mom shared a post on Facebook that was like the same line about this submarine thing. That's like these, you know, trending spectacles or whatever, right? My mom shared a post by some Navajo Indians, and they were also highlighting this thing about the quality of hubris, and that it's the whole thing about taking the submarine down to go visit the Titanic as a kind of a tourist ride. And to give a bit more context, there was, you know, I live in British Columbia, and there's this wealthy guy, Mr. Toigo, who owns the White Spot restaurant chain. For a bit of context, White Spot is a restaurant chain. It's not like McDonald's, although they have like the White Spot restaurant, and then they have Triple O's, which is actually more like McDonald's. And then they have, if you go on BC ferries, and you want to get lunch while you take a ferry to Vancouver Island, all the BC Ferries restaurants are licensed to White Spot. So it's like you get a White Spot burger on the ferries. So they've kind of like got themselves kind of ingrained into the local infrastructure, right? But it is a private, you know, it's a private restaurant, but it's the public I don't even know, is BC Ferries technically a public company, I imagine, right? I don't know, I could forget all the details. But there's the point is that the guy who is the owner of White Spot, this restaurant chain here, apparently he's ridden on that same submarine which was crushed, right? And he has a reputation around the local area as being a kind of a rich guy who owns a popular restaurant chain or whatever, right? And there's this, one of the things that I've noticed is a trend of, you know, not really being sympathetic for rich millionaires who pay a bunch of money for a kind of a tourist ride that itself, you know, you have to sign. And apparently he made a, you know, you have to sign all these waivers, and you have to accept that there are risks, there are dangers. And in my own perspective too, is that like there's so many deaths and accidents that happen every day that don't become international news because they don't, like, when it's in a submarine, that's a kind of a novelty, right? If you just get in a car accident, it's kind of, we take that as commonplace, but that's like our daily life. It's normal to stick ourselves inside these vehicles and go screaming down the highway at fast speeds and having accidents happen, and we don't even blink, we don't even think about it, right? You pass an accident on the highway, oh, what was that, right? But if the same number of people die in a submarine, it's a big deal. It's a big news spectacle because it's something different, right? Anyways, where am I going with this? there was this comment. Anyways, my mom was telling me about the angle, the indigenous angle, where Navajo. This is what I think it's kind of funny, because it's like, how much do these people actually care about this thing, or are they using the news story to this is a good opportunity to jump on the trending wave to get our point of view in there? But there is actually, I think, maybe it was interesting, because I usually take my mom. She was trained as a scientist and whatever, and she has a more rational perspective on things, but she was talking about it in terms of respecting the burial grounds, right? In that the Titanic is you're talking about a famous ship crash, and a lot of people lost their lives tragically, and that to turn that into a kind of a tourist spectacle that rich people can spend their money and that there should be a kind of a respect for the dead and respect for the spirits. But I don't know if my mom was necessarily putting in, like, how my mom relates to this, right? But I thought it was really interesting, because if you look at this from a kind of what will you say, an ontological point of view, about what is the reality, what is the nature of the reality that we live in, and that do we define the reality that we live in by secular science? And if we were to do that, we won't believe in ghosts, right? This is the same kind of issue that I was taking some weird studies courses, and there was an article, I can't remember the name of it or who wrote it, but it was one of the things that was brought up anyways is, like, when you take, let's say, mummies from Egypt out of their, how strange is it to be like an Egyptian, like King Tut, right, a pharaoh, and to be the most the highest rank of society and buried beneath a pyramid and sealed in and going through all these embalming rituals and rites to protect you in the afterlife, only to have a bunch of white people come and dig you up thousands of years later and then put you on a plane and fly you and then put you in, and so that you're exposed in a glass box so that tourists can come and go. It's like, this is essentially the same problem, right? Which is like the white man in his colonial, like the Western Enlightenment, that we have become so enlightened by the age of reason that we don't have to believe in superstitions anymore, and that means that there are no ghosts, there are no spirits, there are no demons and angels, and that if we have the only thing that's stopping us from going and poking around in the watery depths of the Titanic is basically just the technological know-how to do it. And if you want to go down there and steal and pillage all kinds of relics and stuff, like Indiana Jones, all the power to you. That's basically the worldview that most people live in. And I think the Navajo Indian post was basically challenging this kind of worldview and suggesting that it's maybe a kind of a hubris for the Western white man to think that he can go and disturb the grave sites of all these people and not suffer some kind of a karmic consequence. And it's not, it's not saying that the submarine itself had the accident as a direct causal consequence, that there was a kind of like, if you disturb the ghosts have some kind of magic power to destroy submarines, so you better respect the ghosts. But it is implied, basically. And this is kind of interesting, because it's this question of superstition. Is that a superstition that the ghosts of the Titanic caused the submarine to implode, or is it a link? Is it a kind of a jump of making a connection? We're in our own meaning making. Like, if I look at an astrology chart, if I look at a tarot card spread, that it's not the tarot. It wouldn't be the tarot cards that are doing stuff, but you can at least see there's a connection between the specific card that I draw and the question that I'm asking, in the same way that there's a kind of a meaningful connection between the incident of the accident of a submarine imploding and people dying and the perhaps intuition that it may be disrespectful to be profiting off of the, exploiting a burial site or for tourism, and that maybe there's a kind of a, bad juju around it, right? And there's these, and I think this is perfect anyways for Mercury square Neptune, because there's Mercury tends to deal with things which are more commonplace, or at least Mercury's kind of like, you go to the market and you haggle over the price, of yeah, I'll give you this much for that bag of potatoes. Can I argue? Like Mercury's kind of like a deal maker. Mercury kind of wants to deal with things that you can kind of get a grasp on and kind of. And that I think Mercury and Gemini, Gemini is all about diversity and multiplicity and different perspectives. And Mercury kind of likes having a bit of variety in perspective, but the numinous quality of Neptune, which remind you, it's in Pisces, and that's where Mercury has its detriment and its fall. Mercury does not do well with Pisces, right? There's a basic incompatibility between Mercury and Pisces, and Mercury is in its domain where it feels like it can do good, but it's kind of at odds with the square to Neptune regardless. And the way I'm just saying, the way I see this play out is some remarkable hot takes on the internet where there's a collective trend, everybody talking about these media spectacles, and it being kind of funny in that, like, everybody and their uncle wants to get on board and have something to say about it. And I feel like that's kind of like the Mercury is kind of like a bit of a trickster or a bit of a huckster. Or even if Mercury has good intentions, there seems like Mercury's like, oh, I can, look at this one. I really know how to spin this collective thing into an opportunity that I can get my 2 cents in there, and I can get on my bullshit, and I can stand on a soapbox, and I can make some, get people to listen. Like, that's how I feel this is that Mercury in Gemini is like, okay, perfect opportunity to talk some shit, right? With Mercury, if it was a Pisces, Mercury would be flooded out by the numinous and be like, oh my god, I can't see anything, or the ghosts will get me. So, whereas Mercury is in Gemini, Mercury is like, oh, this is the perfect time where I can make a little, like, take a superior position and talk about the hubris of these human beings, and all the while get a whole bunch of Facebook likes and get my message out. I don't know. I don't want to see criticize the Navajo Indians. They're probably being sincere, but there's something ridiculous about, like, okay, the submarine accident. Let's go check in with the Navajo Indians and see what they have to say about it. Like, can you guys at least appreciate there's a certain kind of ridiculousness about the situation? And I was just basically in the midst of talking about this yesterday, I was just like having too many ideas about this. Maybe I was almost thinking about I'm in this habit anyways of doing these videos in the morning when I'm fresh, but I was like, I got too many ideas for this one. I was almost going to make a video last night about it, but I had this sort of process anyways of, not just of spending, I don't make videos like every single day all the time, because there's a certain process that goes into refining specifically what it is I want to say in these videos and where to go with it. And it's 20 minutes, and I've just kind of approached some of the initial things that I had. I've written all these notes of different directions I could go with this, and that's just one of the most obvious ones, right? To give a bit of context too, there was something that happened, since we're talking about Mercury, there was this Mercury retrograde that recently happened in Taurus, and I made a video about that, and I was kind of like implying in this video, to be completely honest, it was a video that I made without a lot of preparation, and I just figured I'm just going to go and do the video off the top of my head, and let things naturally come out of this process, right? And not overthink it too much. And one of those things was that there was a conjunction between Mercury and Uranus that took place. And I have to admit, I was going through my own stuff during this time. And I have Scorpio placements, so my Scorpio placements were getting activated, and I was gonna have this attitude that, like, Mercury the whole point of a Mercury retrograde is that if you make plans during a Mercury retrograde, it's likely that once you get out of this retrograde process, the situation's changed, or something's different, or that your plans don't stick, or you realize you were making the wrong plan. So I had this attitude while the last Mercury retrograde was going on that I wouldn't make plans I wouldn't, and I would just go through it, and then at the end of it, there'd be some kind of like a breakthrough. There would be some, whatever the tension, the problem was that I was dealing with, there'd be some kind of a breakthrough. But I have to admit that I was kind of like, there wasn't this huge, amazing thing that happened when Mercury was conjunct with Uranus, but there was this, in one of the groups that I was on, some of the conversation got a bit weird. I don't know if I want to get into it that much, but there, and I also don't want to make assumptions about other people. But there is the quality of the schizo post that I thought I would mention, and that, I have to admit, well, I don't know if I don't want to get into this mental health stuff too deeply, right? But let's talk about Neptune, right? Because Neptune is also associated with intoxication, with visionary states, with spirituality, and I think to some degree, you could associate with mental illness. Often mental illness is connected to addiction problems. It is connected with the with different spiritual experiences, and there's a kind of the dissolving nature of Neptune, right? This idea of like sin and redemption, that of if somebody is really racked with guilt and they're looking to be forgiven and looking for some sort of spiritual release, or if people hit the lowest of the low and they have a kind of a experience of grace meeting them when they're at a difficult spot in their life. I think these are all kind of like Neptune archetypes and Neptune themes. And one of the things I have to admit is that over the course of the last week or two, at one point in time, I decided to take a break from Facebook. I took a few days off of just not using it, not looking at it at all. And I eventually decided, I'm going to start posting on Facebook. Maybe it would help to express myself. Another thing that happened was that one night I decided to just randomly throw on a David Bowie documentary. Amazon, has this one called Moonage Daydream. That's a new documentary, and I'm always a sucker for David Bowie, so I decided one night to watch it. And there's a couple things there that he mentioned. For one thing, he mentioned that he had an older brother who turned him on to all sorts of stuff like Jack Kerouac and William S. Burroughs and beatnik kind of hippie stuff, or what, I don't know, if he's talking about Alan Watts or something. But like there's all this stuff that I'm into, and then he was saying, but then my brother ended up going psychotic. He ended up going schizo, and then I kind of thought it was curious because I thought the story went that his brother committed suicide, and then David Bowie has this song called "You're a Rock and Roll Suicide," and that was about his brother. I was pretty sure that was the story, but then in this documentary, he said that his brother ended up getting institutionalized and had to live in a mental institution for the rest of his life. Which is, I don't know it's one of these kind of questions where, I don't know, what's worse? I guess for some people, that may be a humane thing if they can't live in society to live in an institution. But, it's like if that's what your life is, living such a restricted life, it's kind of sad, right? Regardless of what it is. But what was I trying to say? Is that there is this thing, that I had. I know I'm thinking about, maybe I should just leave all this out. Maybe I shouldn't go into it. Maybe I should put it all behind me. But I had to be, whatever. I went through the psych system thing for a couple of years, and I at least I've been outside the psych system for a while. I don't have to see a psychiatrist. I don't have to take psych meds. I do have other health problems, but I'm not getting to all my personal stuff on here, right? Well, at least not right now, anyways. The point is that there's something about Neptune, I think, that relates to all this, which can be the inspiration. They talk about the link between creativity and madness, and Mercury being primarily a writer. When I was a little kid, it was like I had teachers that were concerned about me being lost in my imagination. And this was way before I ever got some sort of psychiatric diagnosis. Teachers would observe me as a little kid on the playground playing, and they were concerned that if I was going to play a game like Star Trek, where I pretend I'm, Captain Kirk, and I'm like, beam me up, or what, that I just get too absorbed into my make-believe, I get too absorbed into my imagination, and if I'm reading like fantasy books like Lord of the Rings, there was a time where I was like, I was in a Montessori school as a kid, right? And the Montessori school was a lot less structured than public. Eventually, I transferred to a public school, which was a bit of a transition because I was used to everything being loosey goosey Montessori, right? There's a they let you kids play around and do their own thing a lot. And during one of these periods of time when I was just playing around doing my own thing, I took a book out from the library that was all about J.R.R. Tolkien, and I was looking at the languages. Like, Tolkien invented Elvish. He invented his whole language. He would invent languages that will actually work, apparently. Like, you can learn the rules of grammar and how, and it's like, in Star Trek, how they made Klingon their own language or whatever, right? And I was like trying to draw Elvish runes or how to like come, and the teacher's like, no, don't do that, don't learn the language of the elves. It's like, don't open the portal to the fairyland, or no, I don't think it was quite like that, but there's like, I think there's, with Neptune square Mercury, there's that's really a strong theme, I find, where there's this kind of like, do we treat the imaginal as just a kind of a place that gives us a vacation, a reprieve from the real life? Like, you can just go off to this place and have a little like spa day and come back refreshed because you've dipped into the waters of the imaginal? Or is there something kind of like threatening or dangerous about the numinous, or there's a kind of we feel like there's a risk that if somebody gets too lost into the land of the elves and the fairies, that they'll just get sucked in and they'll never come back, or something like this, or they'll become insane, or that they'll be, I think that these kind of things, whether you're approaching them through writing or whether you're approaching them through art or something like that, these kind of archetypes are going to be very emphasized by the square between Mercury and Neptune right now. I'm just looking at my notes and taking a little bit of a rest from talking here. This is getting to be a long video. It's already half an hour. I have like just lots of ideas about this. Just to go with it, I was talking about this David Bowie movie. Another thing that I thought kind of went with this was that David Bowie, in this movie, there was a line where he was saying that when he did stuff like Ziggy Stardust, he was saying that he had a simple idea, but he felt that a lot of what came out of that was the audience, like he was just mirroring the audience back to them, right? And that there's so much, I think that's also kind of inspiring when you're doing media things, right? In that you're putting, like, if I'm making videos like this, I'm putting it out on display. And I think earlier I kind of was running into this thing where I go through my own stuff and I have my own process or whatever. And that if I want to communicate what I'm going through at a personal level or at an interior level with other people, I've basically decided, like, I don't put everything that I go through, like, there's this kind of stuff that people would categorize as, let's say, shamanic journeying, right? Or astral travel is maybe in the same realm, right? But people have these things where, like, shamanic journeying is like people go on these kind of like journeys in their imagination or through these visions or something like that. And the thing is that, like, some people may choose to post this stuff online, and my point, I'm not judging anybody who does this. or saying that it's better to keep things private or something like that. But I do think that there is something to be said for that you don't have to make everything public, and that I have always just kind of felt that there's a kind of an issue between trying to create content, and also trying to communicate and get over the sense of isolation or disconnection from other people, versus it is, I think, important to keep a space that is private, as being that my own personal inner life, my own personal inner experience, and that to just put everything that happens at that level as like a Facebook post, to say that, in my own inner journey, this happened and that happened, this happened and that, and just putting it all out there for people to consume and like, and it just, to me, there's something that feels wrong about that anyways, right? But there's still, at least there's some of that is going to influence the stuff that I make, right, and put out for public consumption. But what I realize is that at the point I made a video and I put it on as something that people can watch, that there's a question of how many people actually watch the whole video versus if I were to like create a title, right? If I were to like, I'm going to label this with a few words and put it out as a title that people can either click on or not, that as soon as you're creating this kind of object that you can out there, that people are going to relate to that from where they're at, and that they may see things in it that are not there, or that they may project something into it that is their own way of looking at things that is never my intention to put on into it. But nevertheless, it becomes this kind of like that whatever we're doing online, whether we're writing, whether we're making videos, whether we're making content or whatever, is that when we're dealing with a public audience, is that everybody's going to be reading into things their own way, getting their own meaning out of it, applying it to their own lives in a certain way, and it's a kind of a chaotic process. You can't control how people do that, right? But there's this whole thing of what makes, like David Bowie was saying, that all these rock stars, like, all the big, these pop stars, it's almost like the Andy Warhol thing, how he did this artwork of Elvis Presley and Marilyn Monroe, and like as if they're almost like gods, they're like deities, right? In that they become it's the modern celebrity machine takes human beings and gives them iconic status, right? Where they become Marilyn Monroe, or what is a good, or I'm just using that as like it could be anybody, it could be Madonna, it could be you name it, right? These celebrities, they take on something that's not just their own personal personality, but rather there's a collective archetype, you could say. I mean, even people like Donald Trump, I'm sure, are an excellent example of this, that they end up having so much power, not because this is anything that they innately have as an individual, but that they're playing off an archetype that we're all feeding into by being their audience, right? It's like we come to the theater and you think that it's like the person on stage doing the performance is the one making it all happen, but we are all contributing to this collective conscious experience, and we're all feeding, whether it's Ziggy Stardust, whether it's Donald Trump, whether it's Adolf Hitler, or you name it, that we are all making this person who they are, and they're just reflecting some kind of archetype back at us, kind of thing, right? And there's something about why does this work so well with Neptune? Because Neptune, there's something about the water, Neptune being about, there's this book, I am not, I'm about this way much through it, right? I still got a long way to go, but the Liz Green book on Neptune, she talks about this stuff, that if you think about, a thing to remind you guys of is the myth of Narcissus, right? Is that originally Narcissus fell in love with his own reflection, but that reflection was in a pool of water, right? Because the idea of a mirror, at a certain period of time, mirrors were something that only rich people, wealthy people, elite people had. Nowadays, everybody's got a mirror in their house, right? But at a certain point of history, mirrors were actually kind of uncommon, but mirroring happened as a kind of a natural phenomenon most often associated with water, right? And then you can see, and like Liz Green often goes into stuff, there's also things like the myth of the Lady of the Lake, right? Which is also kind of associated with this, where you have this sort of like a anima figure that emerges out of the water, or the lotus flower, right? There's certain, from different Eastern things, like even Buddhism, and they have like the deity or the character that emerges, that's born from the lotus flower on the lake. But the narcissist is like, the narcissist is not just falling in love with themselves, they're falling in love with an image that exists in a reflection, right? And that there's this idea that these big collective movements, these big collective things going on, is that we kind of fall in love with our own image being reflected back at us through the media, which has become kind of like its own ocean. Right? This own ocean of all these different people plugged in and dreaming and imagining and having this big kind of like collective hallucination, and that there's a kind of, whether there's this kind of question of like self and other, in that the way that media is built nowadays, it's all about the reflecting us back at ourselves, because we tell our media what we like, what we don't like, all this kind of stuff. And I don't know, like one of the reasons why I make these videos is because it's an opportunity for me to express myself. And there's certain things where I live with my mom and my sister, and around the dinner table, I've just learned the best thing is just to not communicate, right? But I have this sort of thing where it's like, why do I have to feel like I don't communicate? Well, like, because if I just take a passive point of view and I listen to what my mom and my sister say, you know, they'll have conversations about social media, and because one of the things is that, like, you know, there's Bill C-18 is coming, and my mom has been going on about how she goes to Facebook to get her news and stuff like this, and there's the issue, and like, it's kind of funny because between my mom and my sister, like, they've got it worked out, right? They're like, you know, the way you use social media is that anything you don't like, you either block the person, you unfollow the person, or my sister says what you have to do is you have to constantly tell social media what you don't want to see, so that you can completely screen out points of view from other people you don't agree with, so that you don't have to deal, if there's a lot of right-wing populist people, that you can just scrub it clean, so that the world very well may be filled with all these people with different ideas that you don't like, but you can clean it out so that social media is only reflecting to you basically your own ego. And so this is the myth of Narcissus, and the kind of the thing that, like, the echo chamber. And the thing is, like, I sit at the dinner table and I'm just listening to this, and I read certain books. I've got this huge stack of books. Well, I don't know if it's a huge stack of books. I've got more of these. This is the Byung-Chul Han stack. Okay, I got a couple more of these downstairs, so this is not even the complete collection. But this is one of the things that Byung-Chul Han talks about, is that this is actually a pretty serious problem, that we are building our society like this, that where am I getting my information from? Where am I getting my news from? Well, I'm going to first of all just purify it so that it only tells me what I already agree with. It only reflects my own consumer choices back at me. And, you know, I mean, maybe this archetype is somehow there before with David Bowie, how you go to the Ziggy Stardust concert, and Ziggy Stardust is not really an alien rock star. He's really showing you something about yourself that's inside your own soul, and you love Ziggy Stardust because he is showing you something that you have trouble embodying yourself, but deep down we're all Ziggy Stardust or something, right? That's like that's one level it happens on, but another level it happens on is like this whole thing about, you get into this whole Jungian shadow projection stuff, where there's these awful people who want to, you know, do these bad things, but we don't identify them. We only follow the things we agree with, and we only like having our own opinions fed back to us, and we don't really deal with people. We have this world where we only deal with what's agreeable, and that we can't handle any contradictions, we can't have any frictions. And so I can sit through this and be like, this is absolutely awful that we have this. It would be much better for people to be able to deal with people who disagree with them, or to be able to take in different opinions. But I can't even say that at the dinner table, because then all of a sudden it's like, what, you trying to fight with us? Get out of here. Like this is the I think that there's something about Neptune that you got to watch out for, is that it can be like a tranquilizer where you want to be comfortable. But if you are so addicted to being comfortable, it's like being hooked on morphine. Like you're on the morphine drip, because you're like, we just want to have a nice dinner where we get together as a family and nobody's arguing. But it's like your actual conversation is like, okay, yeah, just unfollow everybody who has a different opinion, and just keep feeding yourself the same thing. And then I can't, I just have to sit back, because if I said anything that would be in contrast to this would be like, we have to eliminate you. We have to get you out of this, go away. Who are you, strange person who has some point of view that isn't exactly in line with our, and that's this whole thing about authenticity or whatever, right? Is that you don't feel like you can authentically express yourself even with your own family, because we have a culture where it's like anything that is different has to be purged out of the system, so that we only have what is this kind of like, what Young Joel calls the palliative society, where everything that causes the discomfort of difference is removed, and it's only like everything is exactly the same, and everything is comfortable, and we're just kind of like asleep at the wheel, right? And that's kind of like the dream of non-differentiation that goes with Neptune in this square to Mercury, right? And there's something else about, I have to admit, I'm almost a little, I feel a bit awkward about it. Maybe I should put this in the video, maybe I shouldn't. There's a Byung-Chul Han, I've got all these, look at all these books I've got so many of these books, and I can't talk to my family about them, but there's going to be a Byung-Chul Han meetup on Zoom, right? And the thing is, it's kind of funny, is that like at one point in time, like people have been talking about doing like a book club or whatever, and at some point in time, maybe I've only read a couple. I've got this huge, like my Byung-Chul Han stack is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and the thing is, I'm so used to being socialized in this situation where I can't talk to people about what I actually think. And then the idea to actually get on a Zoom conversation and actually be able to talk about it is kind of terrifying, because it's like, oh my God, there's all this ideas that I keep to myself, because I can't sit at all this stuff is too controversial to actually just have a straight up conversation with my family about. But then if I go on Zoom and just talk to a bunch of strangers, I run into another problem where I'm like, all these people, there's so many people that are university educated, that either are a better social standing, and I'm just some like unemployed schizo who reads too much, and me being self-conscious about this. And at the same, what's funny? At the same time, somebody down my street, one of my neighbors, is having a little library launch party. And it's kind of like, at the same time, I'm just kind of like, they sent these little girls around to the neighborhood to pass out these flyers about the announcing the opening of their little neighborhood library. And first of all, I don't really want to get rid of any books right now. I have more than one copy of the Brothers Karamazov. I don't know if this is kind of funny, but though this thing about a Byung-Chul Han Zoom meeting, which I feel kind of nervous about participating in, and then for other reasons, a neighborhood library, which is the same thing about like the topic of Mercury, of books. And what I'm saying is that all this stuff perfects on June 25th. It's like the Byung-Chul Han, the Byung-Chul Han Zoom meeting and my neighbors and their little library, it's all perfecting on the 25th, when Mars and Uranus is square, when Mercury and Neptune is square, and I feel just, it's kind of like awkward in different ways, right? And I don't know, my intuition about my intuition about my neighbors, right? That there's this thing about how your neighbors aren't necessarily the people that community isn't just a bunch of people who like the same bands as you, a bunch of people who have the same taste in you, who like the same books as you. Community is like the people who are in your actual neighborhood, whether they're old people, whether they're young people, whether they have this belief or they have that belief. And the problem about what I was trying to say with the echo chamber of social media is that you don't get community, you just get yourself reflected back at you, and whatever you react to the most, they give you more of that, right? And that it doesn't actually, to have an actual community, it means embracing the people that are actually around, including all their differences, and that and there may be tensions, there may be conflicts, but if we've basically created ourselves as these people who we have no tolerance whatsoever for anybody who has anything like a different opinion. Everybody has to agree with us because like this is the client. It's like what Young Chok Han calls like the palliative society. Anybody who makes us, challenges us with a different way of looking at things, a different way of thinking of things, we have to silence them because it's too much. We can't handle cognitive dissonance. We can't handle whatever contradiction. We have to just do whatever makes us feel comfortable, and then we just end up like, watching the same movie on repeat while eating a tub of ice cream in this like kind of just fuzzed out coma because we don't want to think or feel or be alive, and it's just depressing, right? Yeah. Okay, well, this is almost an hour. I think I've kind of expressed the main sentiments of this Neptune transit. There were some other ideas that I had, but I mean, I've almost got an hour now, so this is pretty good. Hopefully you guys like this one. Hopefully I kind of got at what makes this particular aspect, this transit, important to me, the significance of it. Hopefully that, like, I think I did a lot in this video. Hopefully you guys like it. Thank you very much. Okay.